As you came in the front door, you followed in the footsteps of many famous people. Not only have the Eisenhowers come in this front door, but people like Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, Charles de Gaulle of France, and Winston Churchill of Great Britain. Lots of well-known Americans, too. Bob Hope, Billy Graham, Ronald Reagan, they and many, many other people were guests of the Eisenhowers here at Gettysburg. And if you were a first-time visitor to the Eisenhowers here at Gettysburg, at some point during your visit, they would invite you here to their living room. But they wouldn't invite you in here to ask you to sit down on this poof and have a conversation. Company was invited into the living room to basically do what you're doing right now, to just look around a little bit, to see all the things that fill the room. Because the Eisenhowers were very proud of these things. You see, virtually everything that is in this room is a gift that the Eisenhowers received. They had spent 45 years of their lives serving their country. And finally, late in life, they had this first home here in Gettysburg. And when people learned of that, they just showered them with gifts. Now, not only are the porcelains gifts, but the cabinets, the light fixtures, even the fireplace mantel at the end of the room. There is no room in this house that better reflects the Eisenhowers as public people and the popularity that they had than this living room and the gifts that fill it. But unfortunately, this room doesn't tell you very much about their life here at the farm. We know that they hardly ever used this room. Now, there were some exceptions to that. They used to gather around the piano for family sing-alongs. Mrs. Eisenhower usually played. She was a very good musician in the family. She played by ear, but she could do all the popular songs of the day. But it wasn't unusual for the general to sit down at that keyboard and bang out all the verses to a West Point Army song. It was one of those songs with about 30 verses to it, and he and his son John, who'd also graduated from West Point, would sing out all the verses together. It was quite a family tradition. And you would find them here during the holidays. The family Christmas tree always went down near the fireplace, and the Eisenhower grandchildren and all the other presents that filled that just flowed out from underneath that tree. So those were the times of the year that this room really got used. For the most part, living in this house took place in the next room you're going to see. This was the Eisenhowers' favorite room, the porch. This is where they spent almost all of their time when they were here at Gettysburg. You'd find the two of them out here at night, eating dinner on tray tables, watching the news on television. You might find the general watching his favorite westerns, like Gunsmoke or Bonanza. Mrs. Eisenhower, well, some of her favorites were Lawrence Welk, Father Knows Best, and As the World Turns every afternoon. They also had a lot of company here. This is where friends would come for the weekend and have some marathon card games with the Eisenhowers. Now, General Eisenhower was quite a bridge player, and he and the men usually would set a card table up at this end of the room and have their marathon bridge games. Mrs. Eisenhower, she played canasta with the ladies, and they tended to sit at the other end of the room. Early on, the general and his wife gave up playing bridge together. You see, Mamie was just a little too frivolous in her bidding, and the general took the game very seriously. He played with some of the best bridge players in the country. Now, not only did they eat their dinners on the porch and entertain friends and family out here, Eisenhower also pursued his hobby of oil painting. Here on his easel, you can see a copy of one of his last unfinished works. The subject is Killeen Castle in Scotland. After World War II, the Scottish people gave Eisenhower lifetime use of the whole top floor of the castle as a thank you gift for his service in World War II. And when those world leaders came here, Khrushchev, de Gaulle, Nehru, Adenauer, this is the room where Eisenhower entertained them. Nikita Khrushchev sat out here on the porch and bounced the Eisenhower grandchildren on his knee, translated their names into Russian, and extended an invitation to not only President and Mrs. Eisenhower, but also the grandchildren to come and visit him in the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, that trip never took place because of the U-2 incident in May of 1960. And on New Year's Eve, this is where you'd find General and Mrs. Eisenhower visiting with a couple of close friends, watching Guy Lombardo on the TV and the ball coming down on Times Square. Mamie one time said, "We lived on the porch." The general's explanation was that if they ever had to build another house, they'd build the porch first and then worry about the rest of the house later. When guests visited the Eisenhowers here at the farm, usually they were seated so that they could look out the glass windows and enjoy the view. Of course, you could see Eisenhower's putting green out there. That was a gift to him from the Professional Golfers Association. He was quite a golfing president, and the worst part of his game was his short game, so he did a lot of putting and chipping out there. And then, off in the distance were the farm fields where his Black Angus cattle grazed, and the tree line across the fields is Seminary Ridge, the Gettysburg battlefield, the troop line for the Confederates during the Battle of Gettysburg. Of course, Eisenhower was quite a historian, and anybody who came here who was interested in the battle would get a battlefield tour from him. He did take people like Charles de Gaulle and Field Marshal Montgomery of Great Britain out over the battlefield to refight the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, we've just come off the Eisenhower's porch and into the dining room. And this room was used by them fairly regularly. When they had family over, the grandchildren for dinner, or lots of friends, meals were served here. Especially holiday meals or birthdays or anniversary celebrations took place in this room. Now, this is the end of the table Mrs. Eisenhower sat at. We know she sat here because underneath the rug on the floor there's a little buzzer, and she could just tap her foot on the buzzer. That would signal back into the butler's pantry that it was time to have the table cleared or for the next course to bring in. The general sat at the other end of the table, and conversation would be quite lively here. Usually the subjects discussed were fun things like family and friends. Business was not discussed in this house as a rule. This was the place for the Eisenhowers to get away from their public life and relax and enjoy. So conversation tended to be light and quite enjoyable. The Eisenhowers were both good conversationalists. The meals, of course, were correct, as meals were at the time of the 50s, you know, proper table settings and manners. The Eisenhower grandchildren tell us that by the age of 4, they were all proficient in using their finger bowls the correct way. But they weren't stuffy meals by any means. As I say, the conversation was lively. And it was quite an occasion the day that Mary Jean finally had the sheet taken out from under her rug when she was deemed to be fastidious enough in her eating that she wouldn't soil the carpet. It was quite an occasion. Now, here in the room as well, there's something that's very special as far as a gift that Eisenhower gave his wife. Early on in the years that the Eisenhowers got married, when he was still a young officer in the military, he purchased this tea service for Mrs. Eisenhower. And he bought it one piece at a time. He had to skip lunches and roll his own cigarettes to save up the money. But of course, in the old Army in particular, it was very important to entertain correctly. And this tea service was just part of what was expected as far as entertaining went. Fortunately, Eisenhower married Mamie because she brought with her all the social graces. She came from quite a well-to-do family in Denver. She had gone to a finishing school. She learned how to manage a household staff. And so not only was she a good wife for him as he climbed the ladder in the military, but she made a perfect first lady. She knew how to step right in and run the White House. She was already familiar with that kind of routine. And that was quite a contrast from the life Eisenhower had as a young boy. His family was quite poor. They lived in Abilene, Kansas. And while they lived there, there were 6 boys in the family, and they had a lot of love. They never felt they lacked anything, but as he said, as an older man, he realized that they were really quite poor. He did learn hard work and responsibility, though, because he had his chores and had to earn his own spending money. At this point, I think we'll head up the stairs and see some of the rooms on the 2nd floor. This is the front hall of the Eisenhower home, and here in the front hall we have the Eisenhower's guest book. Now this was quite a tradition for Mrs. Eisenhower. Everyone who came here, whether they visited one time or many times, signed in on each visit. Family, friends, so even the world leaders who came were asked to sign in. This page is interesting because it does show those who attended a birthday dinner for Eisenhower in October of 1963. There are lots of family and friends here, though. Over on this page, you can see Barbara Eisenhower and John Eisenhower. John, the son of the Eisenhowers. In fact, you can see above the guest book his West Point portrait hanging here, and his wife, Barbara. John's graduation day from West Point was June 6th, 1944, D-Day. So we all know where Eisenhower was at that time. But Mrs. Eisenhower was able to make it to West Point to attend the graduation ceremony. And just imagine how thrilling that was as a young cadet just graduated to know that your father had just led the invasion of Normandy. Also in the front hall is what Mrs. Eisenhower always referred to as her accumulation. These are little things that she picked up in her travels. Some 5 and dime things, knickknacks. We even have the little presidential figurines that were prizes from cereal boxes back in the 50s. The Eisenhowers, the Washingtons, and the Lincolns. Some of the gifts are little birthday angels from the grandchildren. And we have some nameplates that were from a dinner that Eisenhower attended on his birthday in 1954. Something else of interest in the front hall is the wallpaper that you see as you go up the stairs. This paper has the seals of the 48 states on it. Of course, at the time it was put on the wall in 1955, that's when this house renovation was finished, there were only 48 states in the Union. Alaska and Hawaii came in as the 49th and 50th state during Eisenhower's term of office. And now we'll continue upstairs and take a look at the bedrooms. At the top of the stairs here in the Eisenhower home is one of Eisenhower's oil paintings. This particular one is called The Mexican. It was Mrs. Eisenhower's favorite, and Eisenhower painted it from a picture he saw in a National Geographic magazine. From here we're going to step into the sitting room of the Eisenhower home. This area served as the Eisenhower's private suite. They had a sitting room that they could share. They each had a bath and dressing room, and then they had their master bedroom. The books that are here in the sitting room really reflect the tastes of both people who lived here. The general liked to read histories, biographies. For light reading, he enjoyed westerns. And Mrs. Eisenhower, well, she was a Book of the Month Club member, and she got her monthly selections. Romances and mysteries were things she enjoyed particularly. Something of interest also is the fact that his West Point yearbooks are here. The Howitzer is his yearbook. And his class, the class of 1915, was known as the class the stars fell on, because so many of the graduates achieved the rank of general. In fact, not only did Eisenhower make 5-star general, but he had a classmate who was also 5-star general. That was General Omar Bradley. One of the unique features of the Eisenhower home is the fabric that's here in the sitting room. This particular fabric was specially designed for the Eisenhowers, and it was used in the Eisenhower room in Blair House, across from the White House. Now there it hung, it was in a burgundy color, but it did come in other colors. You see the gold color here, and it came in a blue, and Mrs. Eisenhower even had a dress with matching raincoat and rain hat made out of this fabric. You'll notice it shows a lot of the places that they lived. Abilene, his home, Denver, the White House, West Point, the Gettysburg farm, to name just a few. Another of Eisenhower's paintings is this winter scene called Winter St. Louis Creek. St. Louis Creek was one of his favorite fishing streams in Colorado. And this painting was completed while he was in the hospital in Denver, recovering from his first heart attack in the fall of 1955. As we go ahead, we come to the general's dressing room and bath. The decor, the styles of these rooms really reflect the 50s period when this house was built. The color schemes, the type of tile that was used. The general had a shower. He preferred them. You'll notice later Mrs. Eisenhower had a bath or tub because she liked to take baths. Over the bed, here in the general's dressing room, is a portrait he painted of his grandchildren, David and Anne. Now this is where he'd come to take his nap every day. After he'd had his heart attack, doctor's orders were that he had to take a nap every day after lunch. And this is the room he'd do that in. Now next to the general's dressing room and bathroom is Mrs. Eisenhower's bathroom and dressing room. And this room really reflects Mrs. Eisenhower's personality, perhaps better than almost any room in the house. Certainly she was noted for her love of the color pink, and you can see many things in the room that reflect that love of the color. I think she was also well known for the hats she used to wear as First Lady. Of course, everyone wore hats in the 50s. That was just considered the proper thing to do. And these are just some of the many that she had. One of my favorite things in here, though, is this portrait of Eisenhower that sits on her dressing table. It was one of the earliest things that he gave to her for the dearest, sweetest girl in the world, Ike. That's how he signed it. You see, he was just a second lieutenant stationed at Fort Sam Houston in Texas after graduating West Point. And Mamie Eisenhower and her family, or Mamie Dowd at that time, and her family were visiting friends of theirs at Fort Sam Houston. The Dowds used to winter in San Antonio because some of the children had health problems and the climate was milder. And as they visited on the fort, the mutual acquaintance called Eisenhower over to be introduced to Mamie Geneva Dowd. Well, Eisenhower was known as the post-woman hater, but he reluctantly came over. He was officer of the day and he was out on his rounds. And I think he was quite taken by Mamie right away because he immediately asked her to go with him on his rounds of the fort. He thought she was a pretty saucy personality. And as they went through barracks, he would say, well, you should just keep your eyes straight ahead. There are things you shouldn't see here. And she proceeded to take it all in. She termed him a bruiser and was really attracted to him as well. Well, by the time they were done with the tour of the fort, he tried to get a date. And Mamie was so popular that he had to wait till the 5th Saturday to get his turn. But he wasn't one to be left out. On those intervening Saturdays when she was out with other young men, he would go and sit on the porch with her parents at her family's home and talk to them and get to know them. And when she was dropped off from her dates, he would get to say hi to her as well. Well, that was the fall of 1915. They were engaged Valentine's Day of 1916 and married July 1st of 1916. Kind of a whirlwind courtship. And their marriage lasted for 53 years. At this point, we'll move into the master bedroom, which they shared at night. Now, the Eisenhowers had very different daily routines. Eisenhower was the one who got up early in the morning. This was his side of the bed. He'd be up at 6 or 6:30, over to his little dressing room to get dressed, downstairs to the porch to have some breakfast, and then in his retirement, he would go to his office at the Gettysburg College campus, and that's where he wrote his books. He wrote 3 books in his retirement. Mrs. Eisenhower, on the other hand, would stay in bed late in the morning. She had had some health problems. As a child, she had rheumatic fever, and her heart wasn't very strong. And a doctor had told her that to conserve her strength, she should stay in bed at least one day a week, and her compromise was to stay in bed late in the morning. But she would sit in the bed propped up on pillows, and after she had her breakfast, she would begin her correspondence of the day. She actually worked right from her bed. If you wrote a letter to her, she would respond personally, or if you sent a gift. If she knew somebody was in the hospital, she would take time to write. As First Lady, Mrs. Eisenhower put out more correspondence than Eisenhower did as President. It really occupied much of her time. This guest room is one of two guest rooms here in the Eisenhower home, and this one was known as the Red Room. It's probably most significant because this is the room that Prime Minister Nehru of India stayed in when he came to see Eisenhower. He was here as a weekend guest, and he and Eisenhower conducted private talks out on the sun porch. It was unusual because they didn't have any advisors present. A lot of the other heads of state that came here were here for very short periods of time. Their schedules are pretty full when they tour this country. So they came to visit, they got the tour of the cattle barns, but they usually didn't stay overnight. Coming down the back stairs of the Eisenhower home now, and if we continue down to the basement, we'd find that in addition to the usual equipment down there, there was a small wine cellar that the Eisenhowers had wine kept in. They received a lot of wine as gifts, but they weren't really big wine drinkers. The end of the hall behind us is the laundry room, and we're now going to go into the kitchen and butler's pantry area. Perhaps no room in the house really better reflects the 50s period than this kitchen, with the green linoleum floors and the appliances of the time. Dolores Money, who was the Eisenhower's cook, said it was a very efficient kitchen, and if she had to, she could cook for as many as 100 in here. We know on a normal weekend she would cook for maybe 20, sometimes 30 people, with the company and family and friends that visited, and any of the staff that might need to be fed. Dolores had been sent to French cooking school by the Eisenhowers, but she said she never cooked any of the things that she learned to make because the Eisenhowers' tastes were very simple. Meat and potatoes type of things. Fried chicken. Dolores had a real popular recipe for lamb shanks that was real popular. Potato salad. And of course Eisenhower worked in the kitchen some. He was one to cook Pennsylvania Dutch style breakfasts, scrapple, eggs. He also had a vegetable soup recipe, which he made, and not only here, but had a special little kitchen installed in the White House where he could cook. He used that as a way to relieve the stress. Mrs. Eisenhower, on the other hand, said that she was not much of a cook. She said her claim to fame was two things, fudge and mayonnaise. She'd never had to learn to cook as a child. She'd had as I said earlier, a well-to-do family, so they had a cook, and she just didn't have that experience in the kitchen. But her husband loved to cook, so that made for a happy relationship. Coming out of the kitchen, we've come to the far end of the Eisenhower home, to the General's den. In some ways, I think this is one of the most interesting rooms in the house because of the materials that are used to construct it. This was an addition built by the Eisenhowers. But when they bought the property, they did have an existing house on it, and they had to tear down about 2/3 of that old house. In doing so, they salvaged some beams and some floorboards and wainscoting that you see used in this room. And they basically built this wing, and the wing at the other end where their living room is, onto what was left of the old house. So it's very much a new home today, built by the Eisenhowers. Now when they built this wing of the house on, they built it out to meet the fireplace with the Dutch oven in it because that stood on the property as part of a summer kitchen next to the old house. The little sofa bed in this room was used by General Eisenhower after he got out of the hospital with his first heart attack. When he returned here to Gettysburg in November of '55, he was only allowed to go upstairs once a day. So the little sofa bed is where he would take his naps during the remaining part of the day. Right next to Eisenhower's den is his office. And you can tell by looking at the office that he was an admirer of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was one of his 4 heroes. He said he liked Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, Ben Franklin, but he said number 1 was George Washington. And the desk here is a reproduction of Washington's writing desk. It was a gift to Eisenhower by the White House cabinet makers for Christmas in 1954. It's interesting because it's actually made out of wood that used to be part of the White House. It was salvaged wood from when the White House was renovated during President Truman's time. Farm business was done in here, as well as presidential business. Now, Eisenhower here in Gettysburg had about 189 acres that he purchased originally for his farm. He added a little bit to that, and he ended up owning about 230 acres. He also had a cattle partner who'd owned 2 adjoining farms. And with the 3 farms which he had use of, he had almost 500 acres for his Black Angus cattle operation. And that was really his pride and joy here at the farm. In fact, John Eisenhower, his son, recounts that when you came to see his father here at the farm, you went to see Eisenhower's cattle whether you liked cattle or not. He liked them. So of course you got to see them all. 250 head, all the ribbons that they had won, and after the cattle barn tour, then you got to come back here to the house and relax a little bit. Now this was also a scene of presidential business. We know legislation was signed into law on this desk. In fact, August of 1955, 400 pieces of legislation were signed here. Congress got out of summer session and all of the routine things were brought here to the farm for the president to act upon. This is also the room in the house that had the secure telephone in it. That phone no longer exists on this desk, but it was here during the White House years. It was new technology, and sometimes it didn't always work. You couldn't always get your phone messages to scramble. But we do know that in May of 1960, General Goodpaster, who was on Eisenhower's White House staff, called Eisenhower here at the farm on that phone to tell him that not only had Nikita Khrushchev shot down our U-2 spy plane, but that he publicly announced he had our pilot, Gary Powers, alive. And of course, though Eisenhower had been working to improve our relationship with the Soviet Union, the U-2 incident really dashed all of his attempts at doing so. Leaving Eisenhower's office, we come to the outside. And as you look around the grounds here, you can see some things of interest. The guest cottage, which they renovated from a garage, and Field Marshal Montgomery stayed there as a guest when he was here for a weekend. And then looking out toward the field and the mountains in the distance, we're looking in the direction of the helipad as well. Eisenhower was our first president to travel in a helicopter, and he began doing so during his second term in 1957. It saved him a great deal of time. Not only could he get from Camp David to Gettysburg in about 10 minutes, but we're only about 40 minutes flight time from the White House lawn. And not only did he land there, but many of the world leaders who visited him here landed at that helipad as well. Well, this concludes our tour of the Eisenhower farm, and I hope you've enjoyed it.